Today's lesson will be the properties of rhombuses, rectangles, and squares. The objective is to define and classify special types of parallelograms and to use properties of diagonals of rhombuses and rectangles. So you have to know that your rhombus, rectangle, and square is also a parallelogram. So you're going to have the properties of parallelograms and more properties. So you have rhombus, rectangle, and square. They're special types of parallelograms. So you should know your 6 properties of parallelograms by now. That opposite sides are parallel, opposite sides are congruent, opposite angles are congruent, consecutive angles are supplementary, diagonals are bisecting each other. So a rhombus is a parallelogram with 4 congruent sides. So if you have a parallelogram and all sides are congruent, it's not a square, it's not a rectangle, it's a rhombus. Again, if you know it's a parallelogram and you know 4 sides are congruent, then it's a rhombus. Then you have a rectangle, which is a parallelogram with 4 right angles. If you have 4 right angles and only 4 right angles, it does not make it a square. So here's the diagram. The only thing you know that it's a parallelogram with 4 right angles, it's going to be a rectangle. And then last you have a square, which is a parallelogram with 4 congruent sides and 4 right angles. So you have to know that all angles are 90 degrees and all sides are congruent for the shape to be a square. Then you have the little Venn diagram here where you have rhombuses on the left, rectangles on the right, and when they overlap, you have squares. So that tells us that squares will have the properties of a rhombus, the square will have a property of a rectangle, and the square will also have the properties of a parallelogram. So let's get into those properties. So properties of the rhombus. First property of the rhombus is it has all the properties of a parallelogram. So you have to know that these 6 properties by heart. So a rhombus is a parallelogram, meaning it will have all 6 properties over here. In addition to all sides being congruent, the diagonals intersect perpendicularly, meaning that the diagonals will meet at 90 degrees. And then you have the diagonals are also angle bisectors. So let's go to our examples. So down here, notice that I have all sides marked congruent. So it's a rhombus. Okay, all sides congruent, it's a rhombus. So that's the first property, or I should say the second property of a rhombus, because the first property is it's all the properties of a parallelogram. Second property of a rhombus is all sides are congruent. Okay. Third rule, diagonals intersect perpendicularly. So diagonal is connecting 2 non-consecutive vertices. So D to B is a diagonal, A to C is a diagonal, and they meet at 90 degrees. So there we go, our little 90-degree indicator. So the diagonals will form a 90-degree angle when they intersect, which means, foreshadowing, that you have right triangles when the diagonals intersect in a rhombus. If you have right triangles, more likely you're going to be using Pythagorean theorem or sine, cos, and tan, or 45, 45, 90, 30, 60, 90 rules. So you're going to have to refresh your memory on those rules. And fourth rule for a rhombus is the diagonals are also angle bisectors. So here it's a rhombus, all sides are equal. I have my diagonals. Yes, I know the diagonal here is going to be 90 degrees, but also I know that angle 1 and 2 are the same, 6 and 5 are the same. So I know that 1, 2, 6, and 5, they're all going to be the same. So 1, 2, 6, and 5, they're all congruent. And I know that 7, 8, 3, and 4 will be the same. So the diagonals will cut the main angle in half. So those are the properties of a rhombus. All properties of a parallelogram, all sides congruent, diagonals intersect perpendicularly, diagonals are angle bisectors. Then you have the properties of a rectangle. So, properties of rectangle, first rule, you have all your properties of a parallelogram. So you have to have these 6 rules memorized. So first rule of a rectangle, or I should say first property, is all properties of a parallelogram. Second property of a rectangle, diagonals are congruent. So diagonals are congruent. So I have AC is congruent to BD, which means that when they intersect, I know that all these diagonal sections are equal. So I'm going to put point E here. So I know that AE will be the same as DE, will be the same as CE, will be the same as BE. And the third property of a rectangle, all angles are congruent. In other words, all angles will be 90 degrees. Don't get confused with your properties of a rhombus. The diagonals in a rectangle do not cut the main angles in half. So I'm not saying that these angles are 45. Okay. So properties of a rectangle, one more time, all properties of a parallelogram. Diagonals congruent and all angles 90 degrees. Then you have your properties of a square, which is everything. So you have the properties of the parallelogram. Then you have the properties of the rhombus and the properties of the rectangle. So the properties of the rectangle right here and the properties of the rhombus are right here. So here's our rhombus, but we're not going to get you confused. This is also square. This is square properties. This is square properties. So you have to memorize your 6 properties for the parallelogram. You got to remember 3 properties for the rhombus on top of the 6 from the parallelogram. You got to remember 6 properties for the rectangle plus the 2 additional. But if you combine them all, those are all your properties of a square. So square has 6, 3, so that's 9, and 11. 11 properties for a square. So example. Here's my square. The square, I know that all sides are equal. I know that all angles are 90 degrees. I also know opposite sides are equal, opposite sides are parallel. Okay. I also know if I draw in my square diagonals, I know that all these parts are also equal in a square. I know that they also meet at 90 degrees. So I know the intersection of the diagonals in a square is also 90 degrees. So those are the properties of the square. And the one that I want to also add in, if you have a square, so here's my square. And I draw in my diagonals. So I'm drawing my diagonals. I also know that the diagonals are angle bisectors. So I know that this is 45, this is 45, this is 45, 45, 45, 45, 45, 45, and 90 there. So properties of a square. All properties of a parallelogram. All the properties of a rhombus. And all properties of a rectangle. So a square has opposite sides parallel, opposite sides congruent. You have consecutive angles supplementary, diagonals bisect each other, and you have one pair of parallel sides that are also congruent. So let's apply these properties to algebraic examples. So, first example. First thing you want to do is identify what shape you have. Well, I have a rhombus. So if I have a rhombus, I know that the intersection is going to be 90 degrees. I also know that all sides are equal in a rhombus. And I also know the diagonals are angle bisectors. So this is memorization of the properties. So I know that angle 1 is equal to 90 degrees because I know that these two angles right here, they're vertical. And vertical angles are congruent. So there's angle 1. I also know that angle 58, the angle next to it, angle 3 and 2, they're all congruent. How do I know that? Because the diagonals are angle bisectors, and I also know that opposite angles are congruent. So I know that angle 3 is equal to angle 2, which is equal to 58 degrees. So now, keep that 90 here. I have a triangle. I know if angle 1 is 90, and I know that angle 3 is no longer angle 3, it's 58, I have a triangle. So I have a triangle with 90 and 58. Use your rules of a triangle. 180 degrees inside of a triangle. So this is angle 4. So 90 minus 58 is 32. So angle 4 is equal to 32. So what looks complicated can be easy if you just remember your properties. So it's a rhombus. Diagonals meet at 90 degrees. It's a rhombus. Opposite angles are equal and diagonals bisect each other, which means those angles that get bisected are also equal to each other and 180 degrees inside of a triangle. Let's do another example. Okay, I have a rhombus. I want the angle measurements. So I know that opposite angles are congruent because that's the property of a rhombus, because it's a property of a parallelogram. And I know that opposite angles are congruent. I know that 3, 4, 1, and 2, they're all the same. I know that 1, 2, 3, and 4 are all the same measurements. But I don't know it, so I'm going to label those angles as x. So what we have really are isosceles triangles. So I know that this is x and this is x, this is x, this is x. So I'm going to redraw my triangle. I know that this is 104, x and x. I know 180 degrees inside of a triangle, so I have 2x plus 104 equals 180. Subtract 104. So I have 2x equals, let's fix this so it's correct. It should be 104. So 180 minus 104 is 76. Divide by 2, divide by 2, and I get 38. So x is equal to 38. So therefore, angles 1, 2, 3, and 4, they're all equal to 38. Let's use a property of a rectangle. So I have rectangle RSBF. I have RSBF. Let's draw on my diagonals. So I give you SF and RB. Well, SF is a diagonal, so that's a diagonal. I know RB is also a diagonal, so it's a rectangle. So in a rectangle, I know all my angles are 90 degrees. That's all I know. And I also know that my diagonals RB is equal to FS because that's the property of a rectangle. That has the properties of a parallelogram. diagonals are congruent and all angles are 90. I also know that all these are congruent also. So basic algebra, I have 2x plus 15 equals 5x minus 12 minus 2x minus 2x plus 12 plus 12. So I have 27 equals 3x and x is equal to 9. I want the lengths, reading the question. Remember, in geometry, it's not just solving for a variable, it's solving for a variable and substituting back in. So I need to substitute back in. So I have 2 times 9 plus 15. I have 18 plus 15, which is 33. So RB is 33. That means FS is also 33. So here is just using your properties of a rectangle that the diagonals are congruent. Solve for x, substitute back in to get the lengths. So now let's see if we can classify if it's a rectangle, rhombus, or square just by the information given. Well, first thing I tell you that it's a parallelogram. Since it's a parallelogram, I know opposite sides are equal. So question number 1, it's a parallelogram. I already know this shape is a parallelogram. By definition, opposite sides are equal. So if this is 1 tick mark, that's 1 tick mark, 1 tick mark. So far, I have a rhombus. Property of a parallelogram. Opposite angles are equal. So if this is 90, over here is 90. Another property of a parallelogram, that consecutive angles have to equal 180. So consecutive angles A and B have to equal 180. So if this is 90, this is 90. So it's still a parallelogram. I also know that this is 90. So if I have all 90-degree angles and all sides are congruent, I know it's a square. Number 2, it's a parallelogram with all sides equal. That's all I know. It can't be a square because if this is 130, I know that this is 130 and this is 50 and 50. So I know that all angles are not 90 degrees. It's not a rectangle, it's not a square. Since all sides are congruent, this one is a rhombus. So don't forget properties of a parallelogram. Opposite angles are equal. Consecutive angles are supplementary. Let's try this error analysis. So your class needs to find the value of x for which the parallelogram DEFG is a rectangle. A classmate's work is shown below. What is the error? Well, if I want to make this parallelogram a rectangle, I need to show that the angles add up to 90, not equal to each other. If they wanted to make this a square, it would be true. A square has diagonals being angle bisectors. But if it's a rectangle, okay, they want this to be a rectangle. Diagonals in a rectangle are not angle bisectors. Diagonals in a rectangle are congruent and congruent only. The angles in a rectangle are 90 degrees. So this is 90. So angle addition, I have 9x minus 6 plus 2x plus 8 equals 90. 11x negative 6 plus 8 is plus 2 equals 90. So I have 11x equals 88. X is equal to 8. So if x is 8, it's a rectangle. So those are your notes on rectangle, rhombus, and square. We're going to have a worksheet on this. If you have any questions, please ask during class, before school, or after school, or via email.